Good morning and welcome back to Medellín, Colombia and the Jardín Botánico. We are here at the 12th World Conference of Science Journalists. I'm so happy that you can join us. Once again, we are going through the parallel sessions. We had some amazing sessions this morning, including people joining us by Zoom from all over South Asia. And we had some really interesting Latin American focused things as well. So I'm really happy to have my guests here. And yeah, I think we'll just jump straight in. So Mariana, if we could start with you, and you could just tell us a little bit about yourself and a bit about the session, and so we can get a good impression of what happened today.
Hello, thank you. My name is Mariana Lenharo. I'm a science journalist from Brazil. I'm a part of the Brazilian network of science journalists. Currently, I'm based in the US. I'm a life sciences reporter for Nature. And the session today that I moderated is called "How to Cover Science Critically When Science is Already Under Attack." So the idea for that session was that in Brazil during the pandemic, there was a lot of anti-science sentiment, including by the national government, the federal government. So scientists were doing an intense work about explaining the processes of science and having people trust the vaccines and the guidelines to prevent COVID. But at the same time, it is also our important job to keep science accountable and to have a critical coverage of science. But we were in a delicate position because sometimes when we wrote, when we questioned certain things, how lack of transparency by science institutes in Brazil, this would be weaponized by anti-science movements. So this is what inspired me to propose this session, and we made it into a global session. So we had Noura Belaid from Tunisia, Maria Clara Valencia from Colombia, and Theo Ruprecht from Brazil, discussing their own experiences about how to navigate this issue. So one of the things, I'm just going to briefly mention some of their experiences. For example, Maria Clara talked about the importance of taking into account local and native knowledge in science. Sometimes does not do a good job in taking these knowledges into account. And so she talked about the importance of having a local community journalism, and also having this critical approach when science fails to take these specificities into account. Nuha talked about her experience fostering a community of science journalists in Middle East and North Africa. And she talked about the challenges of communicating with local scientists who prefer to be interviewed by international media. And she also mentioned lack of training of science journalism in the region, and many initiatives that she and her colleagues are developing to improve that. And Theo, he talked about his project, his podcast, which is called Ciência Suja, meaning dirty science, which covers specifically instances where science has gone wrong. And some of the common issues we discussed was the lack of training in science journalism in our countries. So in order to do a high quality coverage of science, and to cover science critically and hold scientists accountable, you need to be well trained. And in some of our countries, there are very few initiatives to train science journalists. So the coverage ends up being just reporting the results and not questioning what scientists are saying. So this was one thing that we all agreed that it's important to improve in our countries, and also the importance of developing a community of science journalists. For example, in the Brazilian experience, we have the Brazilian Network of Science Journalists, where we have a forum where we can discuss these topics among us. So, for example, when we had issues of transparency with the vaccine development in Brazil, we were able to talk to each other about it, and so we knew that it wasn't just us. So sometimes you see something that doesn't look right, but you say, oh, everyone is reporting about it in a positive way, so I must be crazy. So if you have just a forum to discuss that, it's so good, and it fosters so many important discussions, and it shapes the coverage.
And I imagine that's really important for freelancers as well, that if you are by yourself and you're reporting a story and all the newspaper reporters and major broadcasters are just going straight with the press release, you might question yourself to go, well, maybe they know something I don't. And maybe if there are a bunch of you all saying, yes, this looks really fishy, it might give you the confidence to be able to question what's going on.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And in Brazil, like the main media, so everyone was covering science, even though they weren't science journalists. So they would report on these results that didn't have really like raw data behind them, and science journalists were like pressured by the editors to write about those numbers, and we weren't sure about them, and we had questions, so it was an uncomfortable situation.
Okay.
But I think that would be my
yeah, thanks so much. So next we're going to talk to Jenny Aaron-Smith, and she's actually based here in Medellín, Colombia, where the 12th World Conference of Science Journalists is. And Jenny was moderating an interesting session where we had people joining from India, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka via Zoom to be in front of our audience here in Medellín. So Jenny, let us know a bit about yourself and also about your session.
Yeah, you just introduced me very well. I'm Jenny Smith. I'm part of the Colombian Association. I'm an independent journalist based in Medellín. And this morning I was the live person on a basically all Zoom panel from Sri Lanka, India, and Pakistan. The focus of this morning was solutions journalism, which wasn't a concept that I was necessarily familiar with going into the session. And in the specific context of extreme climate change in one of the most badly affected regions of the world. And so this panel this morning covered a lot of South Asia. We had two journalists from India, Archita Bhatta and Sahana Ghosh from Manga Bay. Archita was the moderator from India, and she works as a science communicator for the Indian government. And then we had two other participants. A journalist from Pakistan who's a science editor of an Urdu language newspaper, a large newspaper in Pakistan, who is Suhail Yusuf. And we had a Sri Lankan journalist whose name is Sisiri. And so anyway, they all brought a lot of tremendous concrete examples of not just solutions journalism, i.e. journalism highlighting solutions, but really innovative solutions. So to really concrete climate problems. So for example, from India and Pakistan, we learned about changes to house designs that are causing people to elevate their homes. And we saw some images of that and learned a little bit more about that. There's a lot of focus on mangroves in that region as you have massive erosion of deltas. And so we learned a little bit more detail about mangrove restoration projects and how communities are getting involved in those projects, how children are getting involved in both climate monitoring and different restoration projects. We heard about a coral restoration project in Sri Lanka that was very interesting because, of course, coral reefs were a major part of Sri Lankan tourism, and also some agricultural projects from Sri Lanka. One I thought was fascinating from Pakistan and was supported by the World Wildlife Fund involved, it was kind of an aquaculture project creating crab ponds, where previously, it sounds as though, at least if I understand it correctly, previously fishermen were able to pull in crabs naturally on that delta, but erosion has made that virtually impossible. So these ponds were dug as an aquaculture solution to allow people to continue their livelihoods. I'm trying to think, what else did we hear about this morning that was, something really interesting, although I think maybe Andrew might have understood it better than I did. But there was a project from Pakistan that involved merging glaciers in order to improve hydrology in some way, shape, or form. It was extremely ambitious, but I was just wondering.
Yeah, I wasn't.
Did you not follow it? I think
Yeah.
so. That's our big regret, not understanding better.
And sometimes, as a science journalist, the hardest thing to do for scientists is like, can we go back to that? I had no idea what you were
Well, in
talking
this
about.
case, we could have, because it was another
Yeah.
science journalist. He would have understood. Explain it to me like I'm 10.
Yeah.
So, anyways, it was a great panel, and really, I admired these journalists so much because they're right on the front lines of one of the most affected regions of the globe. And
just really quickly, were there any like common threads between those three places? Because we think of South Asia as like just being like that part of the world, but were there any things that were common to them, or things that were different from place to place?
Well, I would say the mangrove programs seem to me a commonality, right? So, and we heard a lot from the journalists with Manga Bay about getting those programs right.
Yeah.
And also not being afraid. And I saw a piece that I think was by her that she flashed on the screen. Not being afraid to assess the results of these programs. And that goes for tree planting. We heard about a big tree planting program in Pakistan, for example. Oh, another thing that was interesting, and I think everybody can kind of relate to this, is that, we heard of a really basically successful program in Pakistan nearly being derailed by politics, right? Because, I don't know if there's a whole big deal with the Pakistani prime minister. I think he's actually incarcerated. I'm not quite sure. But he initiated this tree planting program, and I think it was called the Billion Trees Program. And we saw some photographs of, the improvements in tree cover over I don't know if it was a 7-year period or something like that. And it was impressive. But unfortunately, that program is becoming a victim of politics because political opponents have wanted to cast every program of this administration in a bad light. So I think that's something we can all relate to in every type of country. How you have a really decent initiative that's popular and gets scuttled by politics. We saw another cool program from Pakistan involving tree culture. And it was, fruit tree culture in extremely drought-prone, dried-up areas.
In a desert.
In a desert, let's face it. So in a desert, using a type of modified jar that essentially dripped water onto the root system of the trees and allowed these trees to survive and produce fruit in the harshest of climates. So, I think it was a tour through a lot of cool, solutions. So it's at some level, an apocalyptic feeling situation in a lot of these countries. These are some of the most vulnerable populations in the world to climate change, and yet these presentations did not have an apocalyptic feel. And I think that was the point. Just the opposite.
There are things that we can still do.
Exactly.
Okay, great. I think we'll leave that there.
Okay.
There are two more things before we wrap up. One is that at the very end of this broadcast, there will be a quick video from our president, Jimena Serrano Gil, and her experience today with Senicafe, the Center of Coffee Investigation of Research, and so she'll have that after we finish our conversation here. And we have a very special guest to finish up. We're going to do this bit in Spanish because we are here in Colombia. Nuestra especial invitada es Shenka. Vamos a hacer esa parte en español, dado que estamos aquí en Medellín, Colombia. Cuéntame un poco sobre usted, quién eres, también cómo es la dinámica de la sesión hoy.
Olet Andret ma Wandan wetin salud shakwan hini yamin hujit kwirip turi cuarca siquichanap kakahni Michoacán, México. Hini waratin holashika hash no upiring halan hi shu kanik Dios mayamuke kayamin walid jan hujit tatenka hujit marco chanka hujit wate shanenga mitzitingongwek Kanik Dios mayamuke yamin nanakacha engash huja mark haka engash huja mark shangarka Kanik Dios mayamuke cha hindesh wingapik parhi ishu ka zipik parhi hitun ishun un guatán. Canik Dios Mayamuke. Mi nombre es Ashenka Hernández Estrada, yo soy de dos comunidades indígenas que están en Michoacán, México, que es la comunidad de Turicuero y la comunidad de Zicuicho, que ambas están en la meseta purépecha de Michoacán. Yo de formación soy psicóloga, hago cine, poesía, interpretación a mi lengua originaria, y pues un poco de lo que se habló esta mañana en la sesión, pues fue justo cómo el periodismo científico puede y tiene la responsabilidad además ética de llegar a todos los rincones del mundo, ¿no? Cómo trasladamos ese lenguaje científico y ese conocimiento científico para que sea asequible a cualquier territorio del mundo. Yo personalmente estoy sorprendida de que estando en Latinoamérica y estando en Medellín, el idioma predominante sea el inglés, ¿no? Que quienes somos latinos y quienes hablamos el español tengamos que hacer un esfuerzo mayúsculo por entender y por hablar el inglés y no al revés. Yo agradezco mucho a Wcsj que haya pensado en esta sesión, porque me parece que sin una apertura a la palabra y al debate de lo que está significando la ciencia y el lenguaje científico y la divulgación científica en otros contextos, pues no estaría completo definitivamente este encuentro. Así que agradezco mucho a Wcsj que haya pensado y a Laura Vargas que haya sido el contacto para que pudiera yo estar este día acá. Lo que trabajamos un poco también en la discusión de esta mañana fue cómo interpretamos la realidad de nuestro propio contexto y cómo eso nos sirve para llevar este conocimiento que se tenga que trasladar primero de un conocimiento técnico a un conocimiento que sea pues plural, y después, si es necesario, traducirlo, interpretarlo a las lenguas originarias, a los idiomas que predominan en el contexto, porque sin esto definitivamente el conocimiento no alcanza su grado último, que es la interpretación y el servicio para la vida de todos los humanos del mundo, ¿no? Pues eso podría compartir hasta aquí.
Ah, súper. Entonces tengo una pregunta sobre la importancia de que comunidades en todo el mundo pueden entender y enterrar la ciencia, y por ejemplo hay muchos casos donde científicos del norte o de las ciudades grandes de un país van a llegar a comunidades indígenas o afrodescendientes o otras comunidades, y ellos saquen este conocimiento, pero nunca vuelven para compartir sus resultados, nunca van a compartir los beneficios que han sacado de esas comunidades. Y a veces están como, pues nuestra financiación no nos empuja para publicar un boletín de prensa en los idiomas de las comunidades donde estuvimos. Entonces, desde tu perspectiva, ¿qué es la importancia que es como un ciclo completo, que si las comunidades van a ayudar a la ciencia para entender nuestro mundo, también este conocimiento regresa, y también que no es algo más accesible, como no es tanto como todo el conocimiento está aquí y toda la gente que necesita este conocimiento aquí, y solo una flecha así, es como más un conocimiento que es más amplio que tenemos ahora.
Sí, claro, creo que desde mi perspectiva se tendría necesariamente, por una responsabilidad ética, además de quien investiga, completar el círculo, ¿no? Que si las personas de las comunidades se abrieron las puertas para que pudiera realizar una investigación científica, pues lo mínimo que creo que pueden hacer es devolver esos resultados, ¿no? Que puedan servir a la comunidad. Pero más allá de eso, yo creo que la misma gente de las comunidades es quien debe hacer ciencia. Lo que estamos como, tenemos tan mapeado y tan incrustado el prototipo del científico y la comunidad, ¿no? Como sujeto y objeto investigador. Y eso no lo hemos podido sacar de nuestra mente, y me parece entonces que los sujetos que investigan pues siempre son los científicos, que además nosotros en las comunidades vemos así como gente de élite que solo va a aprovecharse de la comunidad, y el objeto de investigar siguen siendo las comunidades, ¿no? Y toda la riqueza que hemos resguardado hasta ahora. Y entonces me parece que la discusión va más allá en proponer y hacer posible que la gente de las comunidades sea quien proponga las investigaciones y quien las elabore en caso de ser necesario, ¿no? Porque esto tiene que ver también con un sistema estructural que genera estas violencias, y que para nosotros, obviamente, en las comunidades indígenas es triplemente más difícil poder acceder a esa formación y a esos conocimientos, y por lo tanto elaborar y financiar nuestras propias investigaciones, ¿no?
Sí.
Pero entonces tenemos que poner el punto central en la crítica y en la reflexión de cómo está estructurado pues el sistema mismo, ¿no? Y a partir de dónde podemos abrir una grieta que haga que entonces cada quien, habitante de su propio territorio, pueda autorrepresentarse, autonombrarse y autoestudiarse en caso de ser necesario.
Entonces, las soluciones pueden venir desde los mismos lugares donde están las problemáticas. No es necesario buscar soluciones afuera de la comunidad y capacitar los de la comunidad. Tenemos un ejemplo acá en Colombia súper bueno, que hay una investigador que es un químico que él trabaja en purificación de agua, y en su propia comunidad indígena esto es la amenaza más grande a su comunidad. Entonces, no solamente él puede ser un referente y decir, mira, yo vengo de esta misma comunidad y podemos solucionar este problema, pero también puede mostrar que no es necesario que otras personas vienen a la comunidad, pueden autosostenerse, como dijiste. Ok, yo creo que eso es un lugar para parar. Tenemos este video de Elena. Thank you so much for joining us here. We're going to wrap up with the video from Jimena. Thank you so much for joining us, and be back this afternoon with more from the 12th World Conference of Science Journalists.
Bueno, pues bienvenidos a la Conferencia Mundial de Periodistas Científicos. Para nosotros es un gusto tener realmente la imagen de Colombia, de la economía, de la cultura cafetera. Es importantísimo para nosotros tenerlos aquí, que el mundo entero sepa lo que se hace en Colombia. Así que cuéntanos tú desde Cenicafé, ¿qué están haciendo y cómo aportan a esto?
Bueno, de nuevo, muchas gracias por permitirnos estar acá con ustedes. Desde el Centro Nacional de Investigaciones del Café, pues estamos muy contentos de compartir con todos los periodistas todos los avances que hemos estado haciendo en cuanto a tecnología, en cuanto al desarrollo social de la caficultura, pero también sobre todo lo que es la parte ambiental, porque el café le aporta muchísimo a la mejora del medio ambiente. Entonces, poder compartir eso hoy con los periodistas, contarles con hechos, con datos de todas las investigaciones que hemos hecho, y ojalá que eso sean ideas para poder seguir hablando de café todos los días.
¿Y qué le vamos a contar hoy a los periodistas?
Bueno, hoy traemos un par de trabajos. El primero es todo lo que hace Colombia con respecto a una enfermedad o una plaga que nos llegó, que se llama la broca del café, para la cual nos ha tocado trabajar muchísimo, porque es un insecto que es muy difícil de controlar, vive todo el tiempo allá oculto en los granos de café. Entonces el trabajo es muy importante, porque la afectación de ese insecto es que nos daña la taza, y eso es lo que nos interesa a nosotros más. Eso por un lado, pero por otro lado también vamos a hablar muchísimo de lo que es todo ese aporte ambiental que hace la caficultura, cuidando el aire, cuidando el agua, cuidando los suelos de la zona cafetera, y por supuesto cuidando toda la biodiversidad. Entonces queremos que el mundo conozca un poco más de eso, porque pues ya nos conocen mucho en la calidad, en el trabajo social, pero queremos que también vean el aporte que hace la caficultura al medio ambiente y a cuidar ese planeta que tenemos todos.
Claro que sí, e imposible estar en Colombia y no tener a Juan Valdés, nuestra imagen mundial de la caficultura de Colombia, donde todos, absolutamente todo el que compre un café de Colombia lo va a encontrar a usted en la bolsita. Hoy le estamos poniendo cara, rostro a esa pequeña imagen que nos identifica. Cuénteme cómo lo han acogido los periodistas científicos que han llegado de todo el mundo a verlo a usted.
A usted muchísimas gracias. Han venido ya muchos periodistas a tomarse fotografía, pero también a tomarse un café. Y un delicioso café que tenemos afortunadamente acá. Y gracias a usted por la invitación. Y bueno, esperamos que nos acompañen y que vengan y nos tomemos una buena taza de café, como te decía ahorita. Y el doctor Álvaro, pues también gracias por estar aquí acompañando a ustedes. Un saludo muy especial.
Pues muchísimas gracias a ustedes, muchísimas gracias a la Federación por permitirnos tenerlos a ustedes aquí y esperamos seguir creciendo y seguir informando a todos los periodistas sobre las maravillas que tenemos en Colombia.
Muchas gracias.
A ustedes, muchas gracias. Y le repito, aquí es el mejor café del mundo. Lo tenemos acá en Colombia.
Claro que sí.